I'm the new heir of the company. Ethan Cole spoke clearly, standing in the middle of a boardroom where powerful shareholders were screaming over control following the sudden death of the chairman. A second of silence passed. Then the laughter erupted. The woman at the head of the table, Victoria Hale, the chairman's only daughter, leaned back. Her cold eyes swept over him like he was trash. Security. She waved her hand, her voice devoid of emotion. Get him out. Ethan didn't move. He didn't explain. He simply placed a single envelope on the table. Open it. Victoria smirked, opening it, and the smile vanished. Ethan Cole was 32 years old, and if you saw him in the sterile marble hallways of the Hale Group's massive glass headquarters, you wouldn't look twice. He wore a faded navy blue jumpsuit with a small, frayed name tag that simply said, Ethan. As a senior maintenance technician, his daily world was a symphony of leaking pipes, flickering LED panels, and the constant, vibrating hum of massive server cooling systems in the basement. He was the man who kept the building breathing, yet to the executives and on the top floor, he was entirely invisible, just part of the background machinery. Ethan's real life didn't begin until exactly 5 p.m. every day when he picked up his 9-year-old daughter, Nina, from the school gates. As a single father, Ethan's world was small, but it was filled with a warmth that the billionaire elites upstairs could never understand. He lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment where the walls were covered in Nina's vibrant drawings of space, constellations, and distant stars. They didn't have much. Dinner was often simple pasta, and vacations were Saturday afternoon trips to the local park. But Ethan worked every hour of overtime to ensure Nina had the science book she craved and a safe place to sleep. He was a man of steel-gray discipline, quiet strength, and zero ambition for the corporate ladder. The Hale Group was a different planet entirely. It was an empire built on steel, software, and raw ambition by the legendary Richard Hale. Richard was a titan, a man feared and respected in equal measure across the global markets. But 3 days ago, the empire's heart stopped. Richard Hale had passed away in his sleep, leaving behind a multi-billion-dollar legacy and no clear successor. The company plummeted into immediate, jagged chaos. The stock prices were wobbling like a dying star, and the boardroom had turned into a literal gladiator pit. Victoria Hale, Richard's 30-year-old daughter, was the heir apparent. She was brilliant, sharpened by elite Ivy League universities and a decade of working under her father's suffocating shadow. She was also famously cold, a woman who viewed people as either productive assets or expensive liabilities. To Victoria, the company wasn't just a business. It was her birthright, her identity, and her throne. She was prepared to crush anyone who hinted at a challenge. On the morning after the funeral, Ethan was deep in the basement, knees in the dirt as he repaired a faulty circuit breaker, when a man in a charcoal suit approached him. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the chairman's private attorney and closest confidant for over 40 years. Arthur didn't look at Ethan like a technician. He looked at him with a heavy, profound sadness and a spark of hope that Ethan didn't recognize. He handed Ethan a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a heavy red wax stamp. He wanted you to have this only when the time was right, Ethan, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The time is now. Read it, and then decide who you want to be. Not just for yourself, but for the thousands of people who work in this building. Ethan opened the envelope in the oppressive quiet of the staff locker room. As he read the legal documents, his breath hitched and his hands began to shake. The words on the paper felt like a hallucination. It was a formal, ironclad codicil to the chairman's will, a document that had been hidden from everyone, including Victoria and the entire board of directors. It stated that Ethan Cole was the primary beneficiary of Richard Hale's personal controlling shares. It wasn't just a gift, it was a total transition of power. Ethan spent the entire night staring at the papers under a dim kitchen light while Nina slept. He thought about his father, a man he had only met a handful of times in secret, usually in the back of a nondescript car. A man who had provided for his education from a distance but never dared to claim him in the light of day. Richard Hale had been a giant in business, but a coward in his personal life. Now, in death, He had tried to fix the one machine he had truly broken beyond repair, his own family. Ethan knew exactly what would happen if he showed up at the shareholders' meeting. He knew the mockery, the vitriol, and the disbelief he would face. He looked at his calloused hands, permanently stained with the grime of the building's machinery. He wasn't a CEO. He didn't speak the language of mergers and acquisitions. He was just a dad. But he also knew that Victoria's first order of business was Project Scalpel, a plan to liquidate the maintenance and manual labor sectors to increase short-term margins for the shareholders. Hundreds of men and women he worked with, people with families and mortgages, would be thrown onto the street by sunset. For Nina, and for the people the high-rises had forgotten, Ethan put on his only clean white shirt, tucked the heavy envelope into his pocket, and walked toward the high-speed elevator that led to the top floor. He reached out and pressed the button for the 50th floor, a button that, until this moment, he had never possessed the clearance to touch. Would you step into that boardroom or walk away? Type "step in" or "walk away" in the comments. The 50th floor boardroom was a sanctuary of polished mahogany, Italian leather, and expensive perfume that smelled like old money and power. 20 of the wealthiest and most influential shareholders in the city sat around a circular table that cost more than Ethan's entire apartment building. Victoria Hale sat at the head, her posture as rigid as a skyscraper, her face a mask of iron-willed determination. She was in the middle of a ruthless speech about trimming the fat and moving toward a leaner, more aggressive future when the heavy double doors creaked open. Every head in the room turned in synchronized confusion. Ethan stood there, looking completely and utterly out of place. He wasn't wearing a three-piece suit or a designer watch. He wore dark work trousers and a simple, off-the-rack white shirt. He looked like a man who had accidentally taken the wrong elevator on his way to fix a broken faucet or a clogged vent. "The meeting is private and the floor is restricted," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the chilled air like a surgical blade. "If there's a leak in the ceiling, call your supervisor on the radio. Get out of my sight." "I'm not here for the plumbing, Victoria," Ethan said. His voice was lower than the shouting shareholders, but it carried a strange, vibrating authority that caused the room to grow unnervingly quiet. "Then you must be profoundly lost," a man to Victoria's left sneered. This was Marcus Vane, a major shareholder and a predatory investor who hoped to use Victoria's vulnerability to consolidate his own power. "This is a meeting for the owners of this empire, people who actually have a stake in the direction of the world, not the hired help who sweeps the floors." A wave of cruel snickering traveled around the table like a contagion. Victoria didn't laugh, but her eyes held a lethal condescension that was far worse. "I'll give you exactly 5 seconds to leave before I have security physically remove you and permanently terminate your employment, Mr. whatever your name is." "My name is Ethan Cole," he replied, walking slowly but steadily toward the table, ignoring the glares. "And I'm the new heir of this company." The silence lasted for exactly 1 heartbeat before the room exploded in a roar of derision. It wasn't just laughter, it was a violent outburst of mockery. One older shareholder nearly choked on his espresso. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a cold, amused smirk playing on her lips as if she were watching a poorly acted play. "The new heir," she repeated, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to poison a well. "My father was many things, a tyrant, a genius, a workaholic, but he certainly wasn't a comedian. You, a maintenance worker? Do you even know how to read a basic balance sheet? Or do you just know how to change light bulbs and reset breakers?" "I know how to read a man's final will," Ethan said, his voice unfaltering. He reached the edge of the table and placed the cream-colored envelope directly in front of Victoria. Marcus Vane stood up, his face red with anger, reaching for Ethan's collar. "That's enough of this circus! Security! Where the hell are they?" "Let him," Victoria commanded, her eyes suddenly fixed on the envelope. She was a predator by nature, and her instincts told her that something was dangerously wrong. Her hand remained steady as she broke the red wax seal. She pulled out the document, her sharp eyes scanning the legal headers and the notarized stamps. The room watched in a suspended state of absolute confusion. As Victoria reached the second page, The color began to drain from her face, starting at her neck and moving upward until she was as pale as marble. Her grip on the paper tightened until the edges crinkled and tore. The cynical smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. This, this is an obvious forgery, she whispered, but the lack of conviction in her voice was deafening to the ears of the shareholders. It's signed by Arthur Penhaligon and witnessed by your father's personal board of trustees, Ethan said. The original is sitting in the secure vault at Sterling Bank. You can call them now, Victoria. I'll wait. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of primal rage and terrifying confusion. Who are you? Truly? Why would my father give his voting shares to a technician? Why would he do this to me after everything I sacrificed? He didn't do it to you, Victoria. He did it for the thousands of people you were about to fire, Ethan replied, his eyes reflecting the strength of a man who had nothing to lose. This changes absolutely nothing, Marcus Vane shouted, sensing the shift in the room's gravity. Paperwork can be contested in court for years. This man has zero experience. He has no pedigree. He's a nobody from the basement. Look at him. He's a single dad living in a rental unit. He probably blackmailed the old man in his final days. Victoria stood up, her training as a CEO allowing her to regain her composure. She was a master of the corporate pivot. Marcus is right. Even if this document is legally valid, a person's right to inherit does not automatically mean they have the capacity to lead a global conglomerate. The board has the emergency power to declare an heir unfit if they pose a direct danger to the company's stability. She looked at Ethan, her gaze hardening into a promise of war. I want to know every single detail of your life, every debt, every minor mistake, every person you have ever spoken to. By tomorrow morning, I will have enough evidence to prove you are a liability to this brand. You might have the paper in your hand, Ethan, but you don't have the room. You don't have the respect. And in this building, respect is the only currency that actually keeps the lights on. Ethan didn't flinch. He looked at the powerful men and women around the table, people who had never stepped foot in the sweltering heat of the boiler rooms or the dusty warehouses where the real work happened. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He wasn't here for the prestige or the billions. He was here because Richard Hale had realized, too late, that his daughter had become exactly like him, rich in gold but spiritually bankrupt in humanity. Do you believe Victoria or Ethan? Type Victoria or Ethan in the comments. The following hour was a whirlwind of legal fire and corporate lightning. Arthur Penhaligon, the lead attorney, was summoned to the 50th floor. He walked in with a heavy briefcase and a look of solemn duty. The shareholders were shouting, some demanding a recount of the votes, others calling their brokers, while Victoria sat in a terrifying frozen silence at the head of the table. The document is 100% legal, binding, and beyond contestation, Arthur declared, placing his hands firmly on the mahogany table. Richard Hale was in full possession of his mental faculties when he signed this 6 months ago. He wanted a permanent check and balance for the future of the Hale Group. He wanted a conscience in the room. Victoria stood up, her voice trembling with a rare, jagged loss of control. A check and balance? He gave a complete stranger the keys to the most powerful kingdom in the industry. I am his daughter. I am the one who worked 20-hour days. I am the one who bled for this brand. Why would he hand it to a man who fixes pipes? Arthur looked at Victoria with a soft, pitying expression that seemed to hurt her more than an insult. Victoria, he didn't give it to a stranger. That's the part you've been missing. The room went deathly, impossibly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the very ventilation system Ethan had repaired just 2 days ago. Ethan looked at the floor, knowing that the secret he had kept for his entire adult life was about to be stripped bare. This was the part of the story he had hidden even from his daughter, Nina. Ethan Cole is Richard's son, Arthur said quietly. The gasps were audible, like a collective intake of breath across the room. Victoria stumbled back, her knees hitting her chair with a dull thud. What? No, that's a lie. My mother, my father, they were together for 35 years. That's impossible. Your father had a life before your mother, Victoria, Arthur explained, his voice echoing in the still room. a life he was forced to leave behind to marry into the family that had provided his initial expansion capital. Ethan's mother was the true love of his life, but she was a waitress with no status and no connections. Richard was a young man and a coward. He chose the money and the power. But he spent 32 years watching Ethan from the shadows. He watched him become a man of genuine character. He watched him become a father who puts his child's happiness above every other priority. He saw in Ethan the humble strength he had lost in himself the day he signed his marriage contract. Victoria looked at Ethan, her eyes wide and wet with a mixture of betrayal and sudden realization. She wasn't looking at a lowly technician anymore. She was looking at a brother, a ghost of her father's past that had suddenly taken human form to haunt her. The realization that her father had lived a double life of guilt was more painful than the thought of losing the CEO's chair. So, Marcus Vane sneered, breaking the silence as he tried to salvage the situation. He's a bastard. That makes it even worse for the stock price. A scandal-ridden, illegitimate son taking over a multi-billion-dollar firm? The headlines will destroy our valuation by noon. The board will never approve a man with no executive experience based on a secret bloodline. Victoria did not speak. She was staring at Ethan's hands. She noticed for the first time how hauntingly similar they were to her father's. The long fingers, the specific way of clenching the jaw when lost in thought. She saw the resemblance she had been too arrogant to notice before. "I didn't come here to take anything from you, Victoria," Ethan said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. He stepped closer to her, ignoring the shouting shareholders and the whispering lawyers. "I didn't even want this power. When Arthur brought me the papers, I wanted to burn them. I like my life. I like being Nina's dad. I like the honesty of fixing things that are broken." He looked around the room, his voice growing stronger, more resonant. "But I saw your project scalpel. I saw the names on the list of the people you were planning to fire by Friday. People who have worked here for 40 years. People who have kids to feed and elderly parents to care for. You see numbers on a high-definition screen. I see faces in the lunchroom. I see the people who actually sweat to make you rich. Our father didn't give me this power because I'm a genius at high-frequency trading. He gave it to me because I'm the only one in this building who actually knows the names of the people who build your wealth." "This is a freeze moment," Arthur Penhaligon whispered to himself. The atmosphere in the room had shifted on its axis. A few of the older shareholders, or humiliation, men who had started in the trenches with Richard Heir 40 years ago, were looking at Ethan with a new sense of curiosity and a growing heavy respect. They remembered the young Richard, the one who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty before the money turned his heart to stone. Victoria felt the walls of her world closing in. Her entire identity was built on being the only heir. Now she was half of a secret. Her pride was screaming at her to fight, to sue, to destroy this man's reputation. But a small, quiet part of her, the part that hadn't been completely hardened by corporate warfare, was looking at Ethan's simple white shirt and realizing he was the first person in 10 years to speak to her without wanting a favor, a contract, or a promotion. "You think you can just walk in here and play the hero of the working class?" Victoria asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "You think you can run a global empire with nothing but heart and a wrench?" "I think I can try," Ethan said, meeting her gaze with absolute sincerity. "And I think you're far too smart to let this company fail just because you're angry at a man who isn't here to apologize to you anymore. Do you think Victoria will accept him or fight him? Type accept or fight in the comments." The boardroom moved into a forced emergency executive session. Victoria, pushed by the desperate Marcus Vane, played her final most dangerous card. She proposed a competency vote under the ancient company bylaws. It stated that the board could delay the transfer of controlling shares for up to 3 years if the heir could not demonstrate a fundamental working understanding of the current fiscal year's most complex operations. "You have exactly 1 hour, Ethan," Victoria said, her eyes flashing with a cold, competitive fire. She was back in her element, the arena of facts and figures. "Stand at that podium and explain how you will solve the 15% production lag in our Midwestern automated plants without the massive layoffs I propose." If you can't provide a viable, data-driven technical solution, the board will freeze your inheritance for 3 years of mandatory executive training. By then, I will have finalized the Phoenix merger, and you will be completely irrelevant to the future of this company. Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked to the podium. He didn't have a flashy PowerPoint presentation. He didn't have a leather-bound report from a consulting firm. He didn't even have a pen. The 15% lag isn't a labor productivity issue, and it isn't a management problem. Ethan began, his voice amplified by the room's high-end acoustics. The room went dead quiet. I spent the last 3 weeks in the Midwestern plant, not as an executive, but as a repairman fixing the conveyor logic controllers on the third line. You think the workers are slow? They aren't. They're actually working harder than ever. They're spending 4 hours a day manually resetting the cooling fans because the lean procurement budget you approved last quarter bought refurbished sensors instead of the industrial-grade parts the engineers explicitly requested. He looked directly at the head of operations, who looked like he wanted to vanish. You saved $2 million on the quarterly procurement budget, but you lost $45 million in downtime and frustrated labor. You don't need to fire 200 people to save the company, Victoria. You need to spend $300,000 on proper sensors and give the floor managers the authority to shut down for preventative maintenance without being penalized on their year-end bonuses. The head of operations looked at his private notes, his face turning a deep, shameful red. The shareholders began to whisper urgently among themselves. It was a technical truth that none of the high-paid executives had realized because they never bothered to speak to the people who actually touched the machines. Ethan continued for 20 more minutes, breaking down the company's structural inefficiencies, not with financial jargon, but with the cold, hard logic of a man who understood how things actually worked when they weren't on a spreadsheet. He spoke about the soul of the company, the pride the workers took in the Heir name, and how that pride was being eroded by a leadership that didn't know their names. Victoria watched him from the side of the room. She saw the shareholders nodding in agreement. She saw Marcus Vane's influence evaporating like mist. But more importantly, she saw her father's legacy in a way she never had before. She realized that for years she had been managing a machine, but Ethan was looking at a living, breathing organism. The vote was called by the chairman of the board. Marcus Vane screamed that it was a travesty, a joke, a coup by a basement dweller. But the result was clear, 11-9. Ethan Cole was officially recognized as the lead stakeholder and the rightful heir to the Heir Group. Would you have changed your mind like the shareholders? Type yes or no. The news of the maintenance heir hit the global financial headlines by that evening. But inside the Heir Group headquarters, the atmosphere was strangely, peacefully quiet. Ethan didn't move into the chairman's massive corner office with the mahogany desk. He stayed in the staff break room on the 4th floor, drinking a cup of cheap, bitter coffee from a paper cup. Victoria walked in an hour later. She had removed her sharp blazer and loosened her hair, looking more human and vulnerable than she had in a decade. She sat down across from him at the plastic table. "You won," she said simply, her voice devoid of its usual bite. "I suppose you'll be wanting my resignation on your desk by Monday morning." "I don't want your resignation, Victoria," Ethan said, looking her in the eye. "I want a partner. You know the global markets. You know the vision for where we need to go. I just know the people and the machines that are going to get us there. The company needs both of us to survive the next decade." Victoria looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, she saw him not as a threat or a rival, but as a brother. "You're infuriatingly like him, you know," she whispered. "He always had a way of making me feel like I was missing the fundamental point of the story." "Maybe we both were," Ethan said with a small smile. A week later, Nina came to the office for the first time. She was wearing her best Sunday dress, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at the soaring glass walls and the city far below. Victoria met her in the lobby, and the ice queen of the tech world did something no one had ever seen. She knelt down on the marble floor and showed the little girl a miniature model of a deep space satellite. "Your dad tells me you really like the stars, Nina," Victoria said, her voice soft and genuinely kind. "I want to build a rocket to go see them up close," Nina said proudly, clutching her backpack. Well, Victoria smiled, looking up at Ethan, who was standing just a few feet away. I think you've come to the right place to start. Ethan didn't change his soul. He still drove his old, dented pickup truck. He still made blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning. But the Hale Group changed forever. It became a company that valued the calloused hands that built its products as much as the brilliant minds that designed them. Victoria and Ethan never became best friends overnight, but they became a family. And in the end, they realized that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Value is never determined by the clothes you wear, the floor you work on, or the title on your office door. True leadership is not about the exercise of power. It is about the integrity to do the right thing when you think no one is watching. Sometimes the person you ignore or look down upon today is the only one who can save your world tomorrow. Never judge a book by its cover, for the most humble person in the room might be the one carrying the keys to the future. If you believe that real value comes from character and heart, not a bank balance, subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories for more powerful, true-to-life tales of everyday heroes. Thank you for watching, and remember to always look deeper.